Well, getting back to the studio, of course, not all of their studio experiments actually worked. For example, they tried to submerge a microphone underwater for Yellow Submarine, which basically just ruined the microphone. So that wasn't the brightest idea, but you got to try things. Some of their ideas were never actually attempted, like John's request to be swung upside down from a rope to see how that
Yeah.
affected his vocals. Can you recall any similar instances?
They were really good about coming up with ideas, and George Martin had, I think, the vision as sort of the adult in the room to know whether something was worth pursuing or not. And yeah, they didn't actually swing John from a rope. They did try the microphone in the water thing, and they probably, wiser heads might have recognized it was just, capture the sound muffled, but, it's going to take 5 minutes of your time, so why not try it?
Yeah.
But, there were so many other things, the whole tape manipulation thing, speeding things up, slowing them down, turning them backwards, that was a big toy that they completely ran with on that album. And it was just a matter of, being given this extra time, as you mentioned before, George Harrison working on his backward parts from only sleeping, which certainly took some industry to do and pull off. It wouldn't have been possible a year before.
No.
It wouldn't have had that liberty to do that sort of thing. And, the album's full of that stuff. And it's just amazing that you really had the band and their producer, the recording team, all rowing and being on the same page to that point. They really were sort of co-explorers at that point, rather than George Martin calling all the shots and then being the ones that just, did what they were told.
Yeah.
They had a respect for each other and recognition that they were moving the goalposts.
Right.
And that was a pretty exciting thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure if the first thing they did was Tomorrow Never Knows and they got that to listen to, they go, well, this is going to be quite an album. Well, let's talk about the influence John had on Paul's writing at the time. John had made some real artistic progress on the previous album, Rubber Soul, with songs like Norwegian Wood, In My Life, and Nowhere Man. I've always found the premise and the lyrics of For No One to be very Lennon-esque. I can even envision John singing it instead of Paul. Do you think that was a conscious attempt by Paul to write more like John?
It could have been. He's never copped to that, but I do think there's been an aspect of his personality that, it's pretty implicit when you read their accounts of their creative endeavors, that Paul really looked up to John, and winning John's approval was something that meant a ton to him.
Mm-hmm.
John was not the kind of guy to toss out compliments lightly, and for John to praise something Paul had done, like he did with For No One, or Here, There, and Everywhere on that album, and that meant the world to Paul. I do think that Paul was being equally influenced by his own outside activities. He was very key in helping run the Indica Gallery in London, which was co-owned by John Dunbar, Peter Asher, and Barry Miles. He was helping to run that, and he was really educating himself culturally and with the sort of London underground art scene, film and art and music and, all the sort of experimental stuff as the sole bachelor Beatle living in London, where he had access to it all, and the Asher family's influence in terms of, his cultural enrichment.
Right.
So, whatever influenced Paul, he was definitely striving. And John said, Paul is a good lyricist who doesn't believe he is, therefore doesn't try. On Revolver, he was trying.
Yeah, I got the impression that, you're right, John praised both of those tracks. I think that his praise of Here, There, and Everywhere was a little more grudging. It was like acknowledging that it was good, but maybe not John's thing. But For No One, he was like going, oh, that was like something I'd write. I dig this. And also in terms of what you're saying about Paul's activities at that time, I read the Barry Miles book many years from now, and I'd kind of forgotten this, but my favorite part of that book is the Revolver period when he was living at the Ashers, and he very beautifully describes exactly. I almost felt like I was with him, in and out of the studio, particularly out of the studio, his life at that time. It seems like a great time to be Paul McCartney about 66.
Oh, exciting. Yeah, how about it? And this was the product of it.
Yeah.
I always thought, if you look at it, John had his great visions and ideas of what he wanted to bring to the table in terms of, breaking new ground musically. But Paul was like the best producer John had. Here's Paul that's steeping himself in Stockhausen and, this electronic, John Cage experimental stuff, but he's not applying it to his own songs. He's applying it to John's songs.
Yeah.
So John was receptive, but Paul, at heart, was still the guy swinging for the fences, the one to create standards.
Yeah.
Although he was allowing this weird out of left field influence to creep into the Beatles records.
Well, Sgt. Pepper has been described as a concept album, though Lennon himself disputes this by pointing out that none of his songs were written to serve the Pepper concept. In fact, apart from a title song and its reprise, the only thing that seems to directly reference the concept is the mention of Billy Shears at the start of With a Little Help from My Friends. Interestingly, a strong case could be made for Revolver being a concept album, and not just one. I actually have 3 different concepts I want to get your comments on. The first involves mental processes. In Rain, John talks about being unaffected by the weather conditions of the physical world, and he uses the phrase, rain, I don't mind. In Got to Get You Into My Life, Paul talks about finding another kind of mind there. And I Want to Tell You, George says, it's only me, it's not my mind that's confusing things. I'm Only Sleeping is about that, altered state of consciousness that we all experience every night when we're asleep. And of course, the first 4 words of Tomorrow Never Knows are turn off your mind. So would you agree that the whole band seemed a bit preoccupied with the characteristics of the mind on Revolver?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And that's part and parcel of, in John and George's case, they're taking acid and sort of wrapping their heads around the idea that the material world is this illusion. And it's the subconscious that they want to tap into, beyond the material, this inner mind. That's what they want to explore.
Mm-hmm.
We've got Paul invoking it on Got to Get You Into My Life. That was his song about marijuana.
Yeah.
And so, but it was, while stopping short of LSD at that moment, he was at least acknowledging that what his extracurricular activities were doing was taking him someplace deep within his mind, beyond the conscious day-to-day world. Mm-hmm. And so they were all, in their own fashion, directed toward the same thing. And the sort of illusory nature of the material world, which, George would basically make the basis of his solo career.
Yeah. Yeah, and at this point, it did seem to be sort of tied in with drug use. I mean, later, John would call Rubber Soul their marijuana album and Revolver their acid album, which are kind of oversimplifications, but maybe that's how he viewed them. And as you said, they did experiment with drugs in their private time, but they quickly learned it was a waste of time to try to record under the influence because the sessions would inevitably prove to be unusable. And though it wasn't on the American album, Dr. Robert was about a drug dealer who catered to New York's rich and famous. As you said, Got to Get You Into My Life was, Paul's ode to pot, not a song about a girl. He's a little less direct, so he kind of wants the ambiguity. Of course, it was Pepper that had the all-time great drug lyric, I'd love to turn you on.
Yeah.
But as you say, if you look for it, a lot of things done on Pepper are actually done on Revolver first.
Yeah, as far as the drug thing goes, they were all very careful to not be overtly advocating drug use.
Yeah.
They was tipping their hand a little bit about, this is what we did to achieve this. But the use of the drugs per se was not the end goal. It was just what you could get, where it could take you. And that was why ultimately, within a year's time, they'd given up LSD, at least for a while. That was when they moved into TM.
Yeah.
And, it was really, there was something, this search for meaning of the life that they were living that was fueling this exploration, whether it be pot or LSD or meditation or what have you.
Yeah.
It was really trying to sort out, this very, this life that they never could have, expected to live. And George, I think, was the one that always had the hardest time with it. Therefore, he was the one that was, the one deepest driven to spirituality. Make sense of it all and to find some kind of peace with it.
When you aspire to be a big deal in your career, as many of us do, if you actually achieve it like they did and you sustain it and you achieve it and sustain it at a higher level than anyone has ever done before, you are going to be looking to experiment in the studio or try and meditate or take a new drug or, you got to move forward. And, most of us are like, well, we're never going to be a Beatle and put out all these great albums. So since we don't reach that point, we may not be able to relate to what it feels like to attain money and all these different things and say, oh, what happens now? Now, the second concept I want to throw out there is eclecticism, in the sense that every song on the album is completely different from every other song. Conventional wisdom dictates that a children's song like Yellow Submarine, an Indian thing like Love You Too, and a mind-blowing experiment like Tomorrow Never Knows, they have no business being on the same album. So do you think the mere fact that it was the Beatles was enough to make the project appear to be cohesive, or do you think there was more to it than that? Because it really seems risky to me.
It would have been very easy in lesser hands for it to be a self-indulgent mess by putting together a children's song and, this acid song and, whatever else all together in the same record. And that was where the great strength that the Beatles had in being together and being with George Martin was not only the greatest quality control in the world, but also this gift for accessibility. Plenty of people, in 1966, 67, wrote songs about their LSD trips, or whatever other themes of darkness and death and, just the illusory nature of the world. Plenty of people have written songs about that. Not everybody is capable of writing and producing songs that, you can hum to and stick in your head, that work on more than one level, as catchy tunes that you don't even have to think about what the artist's intent was. They just work. And that was the Beatles' great unifying gift that they applied to all this disparate material on that record. They went into the studio. They knew that they weren't going to approach record making the way they'd been doing it at that time. They started out with the most experimental song on that entire album, and that's where they begin work with. I think if there was a concept in their own heads, it might have been, let's make every song sound different from each other, and nothing sounds the same as anything else on this album. That might have been their subconscious concept for the album. I don't know that it was ever conscious, but certainly, as you described, the sequencing, no two songs in a row sounded like they were cut from the same cloth, that's for sure.
Right. And if you look at some of the really earliest albums they did, 63, 64, the songs were different, but there was a similarity in instrumentation or arrangement or, subject matter. I mean, this one is like left turn, left turn, left turn, right turn, left turn, up, down is like, you're getting all kinds of different things. And the way you expressed it is good. It was like they didn't sit down and say, this is the plan, but, it was sort of an unspoken thing that was what they were working towards. Well, the third concept, seems kind of odd coming from such a youthful and energetic group of guys, but it's the concept of death. In Rain, John says, they run and hide their heads, they might as well be dead. And she said, he very bluntly states, I know what it's like to be dead. Of course, he freely acknowledged the connection between Tomorrow Never Knows and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And Love You Too, George says, love me while you can, before I'm a dead old man. In Taxman, he says, my advice to those who die, declare the pennies on your eyes. And even the normally happy-go-lucky Paul is singing about Father Mackenzie wiping his hands as he walks from the grave. And, For No One is essentially about the death of a relationship. So, when compared to the relatively simple notion of coming up with a fictitious band name and dressing up in fancy costumes for a photo shoot, doesn't it seem like Revolver is a stronger candidate for a concept album status? Or do you think the themes I mentioned aren't organized enough for that, or does it even really matter?
I suppose it doesn't matter. I think that all good art, a listener is going to derive from it their own set of meanings rather than what is handed to them for it to be of any lasting value. It's got to be this well that you keep coming back to and getting something new from it every time. And I think that is why Revolver is such a rich listening experience that sustains itself and has this freshness to it in ways that Pepper doesn't. I'm not telling anybody that I don't like Sgt. Pepper. There's plenty to like about it. But to me, it is as dated sounding as Yellow Submarine is a dated piece of film. It's very much at the time that it was created in. I think that's what happens when, you're reaching outward, to try to impress people. There's a self-consciousness about Pepper that I do not hear on Revolver. With Revolver, you get the excitement of the exploration. Like Paul sings, I didn't know what I would find there. They're on this journey. They don't know if it's going to blow up in their face. But it sure as hell is exciting to go down this path that they've never been down before. And that's what I get out of every song on Revolver. With Pepper, I get the sense that they know in advance what results they're going to get. It's the work of craftsmen. I'm not going to say it's for every single song on there, but as a whole, look at the presentation. There's nothing subtle about it.
No.
We've got Revolver very much going against the mood of the day with being stark black and white. And everything was all pop art, Batman, and all that sort of thing. Pepper is much more of the era that it came into the world of, and not to its, its betterment.
The Summer of Love. Well, speaking of the iconic imagery of Pepper, how do you think our perception of the music on both albums would have been affected if Revolver did have a colorful psychedelic album cover and Pepper had, stark black and white or maybe sepia? Do you think we would have heard those albums differently if we had a different image attached to the front?
Well, that's what's so strong about Pepper, and not even, I wasn't around in '67 to feel its impact, so it's something that projects over time, that it is something grandiose, and it's got this color to it and this, this grand statement to it. This first album that they put the lyrics on, and not just on the inside, but on the outside. So before you even bought it, you can look at them and decide, whether this is for you or not. There's all this calculation that went into it. If it had been in different packaging, maybe. Somebody once asked me in a different setting if knowing the backstory of the creation of songs, say for instance on the White Album, where there was fighting going on and bitterness and that sort of thing, does that affect what you think of the music, knowing what went into the creativity of it? And I have to say honestly that in the Beatles' case it doesn't. I can be aware of the fact that three of the Beatles didn't care for Obla Di Obla Da or Maxwell Silver Hammer, but whether I like the records or not, that is sort of beside the point. If Revolver came charted up in color, maybe I might think of it as a little more dated because it would have looked so 1966, Carnaby Street and all that. But, it's hard to say. I think what makes it fresh is that not only was it sort of in opposition to its own time, but that sort of styling, what the Beatles looked like, at that time, kind of came back into vogue, years later. It was very interesting when you saw the restored clips of Paperback Writer and Rain that they filmed with Michael Lindsay Hogg in the spring of '66, and you see them in good, vibrant color, and they look like a band that could have came out in 1995.
Yeah. Is that the one where Paul had his chipped tooth?
Yeah, right, exactly.
You think if he knew it was going to be on film, he would have, capped it or done something that had this big gap in his mouth.
Remember with John's missing beat theories, let's see who notices.
Yeah, well, maybe, apparently that's why Paul grew the mustache, because he'd fallen off a motorcycle or something, and then they all grew mustaches. Who knows? Now, I do agree with your premise that the creative leap from Rubber Soul to Revolver was a greater one than from Revolver to Pepper, but what about the leap from Love Me Do in 1962 to Tomorrow Never Knows 4 years later in 1966? I mean, talk about some pretty astounding, musical progress in a relatively short period of time.
It's unbelievable. In 3 years from She Loves You, the summer of '63 single, beautifully crafted, energetic, pure pop, to this stuff that, I don't know, only a band that successful could put it out something like that and make it work. You had Frank Zappa and the Mothers, who never sold anywhere near as many records as the Beatles did, doing Freak Out in '66, and it doesn't have that accessibility or engagement, which is not to say it's an unenjoyable record. It's a great album, it's a terrific album. Velvet Underground later on came out, and there's another thing that was not calculated for the masses, but still has a sort of freshness to it. But the Beatles were the ones I think that came the farthest in their art. Really rooted Tin Pan Alley traditions when they started out, and took it broke these barriers in showing what a rock band can do. How you didn't have to be beholden to what you could play on stage. And that's a major statement they made with Revolver.
Yeah, and you're right, they're uniquely gifted in the sense that, another band might have had the same concept of what to do, but they had this way of doing something experimental and keeping it accessible to the masses. So very rare and unique ability.
Sure. I mean, look at the Stones. They did their psychedelic album in '67, and everybody just slammed them for it.
Well, you're talking about John and Mick being friends. That's true, but, John always said, the Rolling Stones just did everything we did, but however many months later. If we used a sitar on Norwegian Wood, here comes Painted Black. If we did Sgt. Pepper, here comes Her Satanics. It's like, oh, the Beatles are doing this. So this is what I mean about a leader and a follower and pushing it. And I love the Stones. I would never, criticize them, but John did, make that point. I think it was in Rolling Stone or something.
Chapter first, Yesterday followed by As Tears Go By.
Right.
That there definitely was that pattern for a while there, but the Stones were the Stones, And they made maybe their best work after the Beatles broke up.
Yeah, they're on a different trajectory. I mean, the thing is, Mick and Keith were kind of like, watching TV. The Beatles come on, they go, oh, this looks interesting. Let's start a band. So, it was kind of like, their entire existence kind of wouldn't have happened if, so they're definitely going to be a leader and a follower. But as you pointed out, they went on to do a lot of things, that clearly earned their, rep as a great band. We all have our opinions about the various Beatle albums, but in terms of Paul's assessment of his own work, I think it's pretty telling that of the 6 Beatles songs he decided to re-record for his Give My Regards to Broad Street project in 1984, 4 of the 6 were from Revolver, and none were from Pepper.
Yeah, well, I don't know what was in his head, but you have to think, I'm not a person that's going to bash him for his post-Beatles career other than to say it's a pity he recorded as much as he did. Because if he recorded half as much and issued the right half, maybe his reputation wouldn't have suffered as much. If he had the quality control and not just tossed out every musical idea he ever had. And if maybe there was recognition in the 80s, like, damn, I wrote some really good songs when I was 24 years old.
Well, I'm sure it was difficult working with John Lennon, but I'm sure they both, John Lennon was, honest. He'd say, look, I don't think that's good. And he might not even be that diplomatic about how he said it, and I'm sure it hurt Paul's feelings, but the Beatles' quality level was very high as a result.
They just canceled out each other's weaknesses so well.
Right.
I'm not taking anything away from what they did as individuals, but in terms of getting the most bang for the buck. You put those 4 people together, and it really was 4 people. I don't buy what John said, well, it was me and Paul that made the music, and George and Ringo were irrelevant. That's bull. They all brought something to the table, and I think we're hearing more and more through the years of what George really gave the Beatles on songs that did not have his name in the credit.
Yeah.
Coming up with the riff, the entire lick that And I Love Her hinges on. And that was him. He came up with the riff for You Can't Do That.
Right.
There's any number of things that he contributed to the Lennon-McCartney songs that made them, elevated them and brought them to what they became, brought that level of greatness to them. And they would say the same, they, contributed lyrics like John did for Taxman, Declare the Pennies on Your Eyes. It's such a Lennon line.
Yeah. Well, to that point, I can't remember who it was. I don't know if it was Jeff Emmerich or Alan Parsons or one of the people who was in the studio with the Beatles a lot, but was more like a tape operator, had made the point that sometimes, it was during the White Album, I believe, you'd have one Beatle in the studio or 2 or even maybe 3. But when you had all 4, he said you had the magic. When you had all 4 of those guys working together, there was just a magical presence. It was like with Zeppelin and the alchemy of those 4 guys. He said, yeah, you could have 2 or 3 of them doing something, but anytime the 4 of them were there, it was a palpable thing he felt in the studio.
Yeah, and I don't doubt it. When you just see what they were capable of doing on their own and just the magic that they threw around them, I don't even know what it must have been like to have all 4 of them in the same room at once. And how could you stand it? Your jaw would be on the floor.
Well, I know your knowledge of the Beatles isn't limited to Revolver, so let's wander off topic for a minute and get your take on a few other Beatle-related matters. In While My Guitar Gently Weeps, when George says, I look at you all, see the love there that's sleeping, I always assumed he was talking about the entire population of the world, not being loving enough. But I've since heard that he might have been addressing the other 3 Beatles, about their declining feelings for each other. What's your take on that, and who do you think plays a weepier guitar, George or Eric Clapton?
To answer the first question, I think that for George, he loved being able to put together something that had more than one level of meaning to it.
Yeah.
So many of his apparently romantic songs can just as easily be about God, and he would say as much, So it wouldn't surprise me if he was addressing, the greater, of humanity as well as 3 guys in the same room with him, and being happy that he made that statement work. So that wouldn't surprise me. Weepier guitar, Eric does a tremendous job on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. I mean, he really brought something to the table, and it snapped everything into place, I think. But ultimately, he is a very advanced, evolved blues guy. George doesn't have those blues roots, really. And I think that he is so completely underrated as a guitar player, which is too bad. But he played slide guitar like nobody else on earth, because he played it not rooted in blues, but he played it like a voice. And you talk about guitar gently weeping. Just listen to some of the stuff he did in the 70s on his own and afterwards. I mean, that sound, it makes you cry, in the right setting. What he did was amazing and very unique in all of rock.
Yeah.
And I think other musicians knew it, but I think the public's more tuned to pyrotechnics, and they weren't as prepared to really give him his due.
Yeah, it seems like George was more about Chet Atkins and Chuck Berry and things like that as his, original Carl Perkins or what have you. But yeah, that's very true. And of course, Clapton's presence on the song. And you're right, it probably was a multi-layered thing. He thought, no one will be quite sure what I'm saying. Similarly, I'd always assumed that in "Don't Let Me Down," John was addressing Yoko, but it's been suggested that also could be a case of a band member indirectly addressing the other three. So do you think John was asking Yoko not to let him down, asking the other Beatles not to let him down, or was he just singing about Frank Sinatra again? Don't let me down, Frank.
Right. I don't think at that point John would have been even consciously willing to give the other Beatles that kind of, sign of, don't let me down. I don't know, because, he was, when he did that song, he was, undergoing heroin use at the time, was very disinterested in being a Beatle, and I think it took him a good number of years after the Beatles split to really recognize what he had. He liked playing with Ringo on his solo stuff. He said many times that, we know each other so well that if I do this little sound on guitar, he knows where to go with it. And he clearly liked what George brought to the table, because he used him on almost half of the Imagine album.
Yeah.
And I do think that if things had played out differently, he and Paul would have worked together again. I know that the interest was there on both their parts during the 70s, and John actually sort of felt out Art Garfunkel on the subject of what it was like working with Paul Simon again. Would you recommend it, and what do you think? I'm thinking about getting together with Paul. He had this sort of public statement of going to New Orleans when Paul and Wings were recording Venus and Mars in early 75.
Yeah.
But, he got back together with Yoko, she became pregnant, he won his immigration case that year, and the visit never came off. They'd see each other socially off and on, but I do think the interest was there in making music with Paul again. And he just never got around to fulfilling it.
Well, in the Lennon documentary, Imagine, that came out in the late 80s, there was a scene where a fan had been camping out on John's property, and when he was brought up to the house to meet John, it was pretty obvious that he considered John to be some sort of prophet and saw himself as John's disciple. John seemed very uncomfortable with that sort of reaction to his work, but do you think it's all that surprising, considering how John often assumed the role of leader or at least instructor in many of his songs, which he knew were going out to a mass global audience? I mean, in his song "The Word," he literally says, "I'm here to show everybody the light." So, most of us don't take that seriously, but there are bound to be a few who do.
Mm-hmm. I think he's very conflicted about it. Like so many things in his life, on the one hand, the things that were revelations to him, he wanted to share with everybody. Whatever it was, whether it was, women's lib, or, how to trip properly, or, love is the answer.
Mm-hmm.
He very much saw himself as this role as sort of an evangelizing it. But, it was like if humanity was an abstract, it was a lot easier than to deal with the reality of individuals besieging him and wanting a piece of him. Mm. Even to the end of his life, there's that bit of footage of him walking around New York. When are the Beatles getting back together? When are you going back to high school? It's just like, there was definitely resentment of people looking to him to give them some sort of insight. But on the other hand, anytime he had an insight, he felt compelled to share it. Mm. So I think he was sort of two minds about that, like he was about so much else.
Yeah, he was a very sharing guy and very generous with his talent, in a sense, and very open about his opinions, and just threw it out there and figured it was really didn't have any value unless he was really honest about everything. And that's true. I mean, if he latched on to he was very political there for a little while in New York, and some of that stuff seems dated. We're speaking about specific cases, Angela Davis or something. But you
Right.
know, it was like that's one way to do it, sort of a snapshot of your day. And of course,
Right.
the tragedy of the end of his life was because one of the people that his music had reached, because a guy like him who reaches out to millions of people, you never know who's getting it, and one of them took it to the degree that he ended his life.
Yeah.
Sad.
And it was something that was remarked upon by people that knew him. One of the horn players that had worked on the Walls and Bridges album said he was just astonished that not only was John leaving himself so vulnerable walking the streets of New York, which he liked to do, but he would actually, approach people, approach strangers, as long as they weren't coming up to him, for the Beatles stuff, just wanting to know about them and chat with them. And, this guy couldn't believe how John would leave himself so wide open to that. But I think there was a part of him that genuinely wanted to know what other lives were like and to share what he had to share, his own experiences. He did it best through his music. I mean, his great gift was to take what had been his own personal experiences and channel it into something that was universal.
Yeah.
Anything that he felt, whether it was, the trauma of his childhood or, his romance with Yoko, he was able to make that into a statement that everybody could relate to. And where he failed would be when he would take other people's stuff and it was inauthentic and try to present it as his own.
Right.
That's where I think his heaviest political stuff was the most instantly dated because it did come off as false.
Like a poser.
Yeah, exactly. Like he's just hectoring people with somebody else's slogans. And, you knew the difference between when John Lennon meant it, it came from his heart, versus him seizing other people's stuff and trying to, be the troubadour, just, singing it out there, putting it out there, but it wasn't really from him.